I guess we shall start. Uh, Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. And welcome to the talk, Creation and Witnessing After Spitak, Responses to Gyumri's Destruction with Elis Schlecht, Master of Arts in Regional Studies, Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe, from Columbia University's Harriman Institute doctoral candidate and ARISC member. I'm Ania Prisan, the resident director of ARISC Armenia branch, and we are delighted to have you all here today. A few notes before we begin. During the lecture, we have turned off the microphone feature. However, once we reach the question and answer portion, we will turn that component on. If you are on a mobile device, I recommend plugging into an outlet so as not to run out of battery in an hour. Be sure that you have a strong internet connection for your device and make sure you are not running other applications in the background. We will begin today's talk with words of welcome for our audience and a brief introduction of Elise. After Elise's talk, we will have time for questions from our audience. And if you can see, we have a live transcript enabled for this event. So a couple of words about ARISC. The American Research Institute of the South Caucasus is an American overseas research center, an independent not-for-profit that supports research in the South Caucasus and the US. ARISC encourages and supports scholarly study of the South Caucasus states across all disciplines of the humanities, sciences, and social sciences. You can find more information about us and our future upcoming lectures and programming on our website, visiting www.arisc.org. So now let me introduce our today's speaker. Elise Schlecht is a doctoral candidate in art history at Emory University, specializing in modern architecture with a focus on Armenia and the former Soviet Union. She holds a BA in Russian Regional Studies from Bernard College, an MA in Russian Eastern Europe and Eurasian Regional Studies from Columbia University's Harriman Institute, and an MA in Art History Medieval Architecture from Emory University. Her research is supported by the Galus Gulbenkian Foundation and the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies. She is also a 2026 doctoral researcher in residence at the Centre Canadian Architecture. Her dissertation, Armenian Familiar Architecture and Adaptation in Armenian Soviet Mass Housing 1964-1991, concerns local adaptations of standard mass housing designs in Soviet Armenia's three largest cities, Yerevan, Vanador, and Gyumri. In Gyumri specifically, she investigates whether planners accommodated seismic precarity in mass housing design and how the 1988 Spitak earthquake and resulting destruction of Armenian Soviet residential infrastructure impacted local creative production. Today, she presents a part of this research entitled Creation and Witnessing After Spitak Responses to Gyumri's Destruction. Now I pass the floor to you, Elise.
Thank you, Ani. I share my screen and then we will begin. Sharing. Is it visible for everyone? All right, wonderful. All right. Again, thank you, Ani, for the lovely introduction and providing a bit of the context of the broader project of which this is only a section. So as she mentioned, this is a chapter draft for a part of my larger dissertation, and this is concerning the section on Gyumri architecture in the later Soviet period. And specifically, I'm looking at how architects and planners adapted to the seismic conditions in northern Armenia. How those things were codified, how they were implemented, and that which comprises one chapter. And then here I'm talking about more, I guess you would say, less bureaucratic responses to how Spitak played out. Um, and the visible failure of infrastructure after the earthquake. The citizen responses, are the subject of today's discussion. So, without further ado, we begin. So, as many of you may know, at 11:40 a.m. on December 7th, 1988, Soviet Armenia experienced one of the most powerful earthquakes the South Caucasus had felt, registering between 10 and 11 of a possible 12 points on the MSK scale. Seismic waves radiated outward from under the city of Spitak here in northern Armenia, affecting an area that was home to over 1 million people. 25,000 victims were confirmed to have died, 130,000 were injured, and over 500,000 individuals were left homeless. The northwestern city of Gyumri, up here, Armenia's second largest city with a pre-earthquake population of over 200,000, was one of the most heavily damaged settlements, experiencing approximately 80% destruction. Uh,
Elise,
yes.
apologies for interrupting. Did you want to open up the slideshow so that we see the full
Oh,
slide?
I thought I had. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah,
Let me stop and see if I can share this one more time correctly because it was looking right on my end. Share, share my entire screen here, and then
perfect. Thank you.
this is working. All right. Thank you so much for letting me know. Okay. So here we are. Relief efforts led by citizen volunteers included rescue operations, medical and food aid, and construction assistance, and were bolstered by representatives of over 100 nations for the first time in the history of the Soviet Union. Emblematic of the fall of the humanitarian wall, international news media descended upon Soviet Armenia to make the tragedy known across the globe in images such as this. Reconstruction began with Gorbachev's hopeful promise of its completion in 2 years, but ultimately, perestroika, the Karabakh crisis, and the collapse of the Soviet Union left Armenians to rebuild largely on their own. And despite efforts to liquidate the consequences of the earthquake in the Zona Bedstvia, physical and emotional scars remain. They persist to this day, linking the city's present form to the history of its destroyed form and the sense of loss embodied in the image of urban destruction. Now, for me, this raises a few questions. Namely, how does a city and its citizens come to term with the enduring legacy of destruction? And more specifically, for me as a historian of art and architecture, I'm interested in how the image of the city's destruction affects subsequent creative production and to what end. So these questions form the basis of my inquiry into creative responses to the trauma of the 1988 Spitak earthquake. And in this presentation, I will be examining post-earthquake creative production, especially creations that take the image of the destroyed city of Gyumri as their focus, in order to explore the role of images of architectural destruction in the mourning process. And I am focusing on contemporary amateur photography in the form of a private photo album of images of ruined public housing, accompanied by an explanatory poem, which I analyze in conjunction with Ulrich Baer's notion of photography as a medium through which to process traumatic experiences by repeated witnessing. I had also planned to discuss a few other memorials in this talk, but as I dove into the album, I found that there was much more to say about it than I had originally planned. And like the processes of witnessing and grief itself, it is incredibly complex and layered. Um, so we will be spending all of our time with the album. All right. Now, as I mentioned previously, in the days immediately following the earthquake, the international media understandably flocked to Gyumri, and press photographs such as this one of Gyumri's destroyed church tend to dominate visual narratives of the earthquake and its aftermath. However, perhaps the most interesting visual representations of post-earthquake Gyumri that I have found are a bit more personal than that and fell into my lap a bit more by accident. Um, I don't know if anyone can relate to having to scour eBay for books pertaining to the history of Soviet Armenia because they're not as widely available as books on other topics. But in spring of 2024, while doing exactly that, I stumbled upon this photo album containing photographs from post-earthquake Gyumri, and I have it with me here at my desk um, as my little buddy while I talk about it. What struck me initially, just, seeing the listing, was the incredibly stark contrast between the materiality of this album itself and the contents of the photographs that it contains. So first, on the surface, we have this beautiful navy velvet cover, embossed with gold where it says album, bound with a cream satin ribbon. It's incredibly beautiful quality. While inside there are photographs that show Gyumri's devastated housing stock in rather unflinching detail. And at my first impression, something about especially how this bow was tied seemed so tender to me, especially considering the horrifying nature of the destruction documented within. And to me, it seemed indicative of the care of the individual who had assembled this album, that they were willing to dedicate their time, their skill, their financial resources to documenting these things. And this was no small feat. It was the album itself would likely cost a day's wages or more. It's labeled the price is given as 6 rubles 50 kopecks, and that's for the album only. No photo paper, no developing, no chemicals, no nothing. And this person had dedicated their time and energy to clothing photographs of architectural devastation in this beautiful book. So someone wanted these images to be preserved, and quite beautifully so. So naturally, curiosity piqued. I order it for myself. Um, and when it arrived weeks later, I was frankly awed. Inside the cover are 18 glossy gelatin silver prints, just like this one, mounted on this beautiful unbleached cardstock with tissue interleaves, and each image bearing the caption Armenian Tragedy. Uh, so there we are, providing a possible explanation for these images or their photographer's motivation in compiling them into an album, um, is this sort of prefatory newspaper clipping of Arameus Sahakyan's poem Resist People on this page of cardstock that has been blacked out with a marker by hand. Obviously, I will not read the entire poem because that would take a bit too much of our time, but a few salient lines will highlight some of the themes that I am arguing this photographer was working with when taking these images and compiling the album. So Sahakyan writes, "What happened to the Armenian world? It is a global tragedy. We were a handful of people, we've become half a handful, and that halfness is a silent tear. Lord God, there are so many dry deserts. Why should there be one here where the saved nation is gathered? Is the greatest pain always given to the strongest? Oh, why has pain been a constant friend throughout our lives?" Then a few lines later, "We have never destroyed the homes of others. Why should ours be destroyed? The land we worship has taken us in its embrace. The stone we worshipped fell on our heads." Later on, "We have had centuries of victims, but so many victims in a single second. Once again, a part of the Armenians is missing." And Sahakyan's verses are clearly lamenting the loss of yet another part of the Armenian world. For him, the earthquake is another tragedy in a long history of national tragedies, and a history that he is clearly frustrated by. From his perspective, other nations are quote unquote deserts on whom the rain of tragedy rarely falls. And in his argument, Armenia has received more than its share of tragedy. And now, this time, to add insult to injury, this latest one has claimed the lives of thousands in mere seconds. Soghoyan's metaphors eulogize the Armenian landscape and that of the city of Gyumri, emphasizing the fraught relationship between the Armenian people and the land that they have loved for thousands of years. And now, including this poem as a sort of introduction or preface to the album's creator, who is identified in the colophon as one Mr. Charchoglian, provides a sort of emotional lens through which any viewer besides himself might approach these photographs of Gyumri's ravaged homes. In addition to setting the tone for the rest of the album, a very mournful tone, mind you, Sahakyan's poem gives voice to some of the questions that tend to plague the human psyche as it struggles to come to terms with catastrophe, such as, what did I do to deserve this? Why did it happen here? Why did it happen now? Haven't we suffered enough? And now, with this preface, we turn to the photographs themselves. Yes, here we are. So, this is the first photograph in the album, and it shows a collapsed steel frame building uh, surrounded by concrete, wire, glass, and rubble in a mound where the majority of the building once stood. From the photographer's vantage point across the street, an empty taxi is sitting in the foreground, and two figures on the sidewalk opposite are giving us a sense of scale of the destruction as they are absolutely dwarfed by this pile of rubble. Um, they don't seem to be acknowledging the pile, only each other. There's seemingly nothing they can do about it, as it is so much larger than them, except perhaps support each other or look at each other. The cut off telephone pole here, power lines, and taxi give us the sense of an expansive world that is escaping the frame. It's not, as some photographers would like you to think, its own little image of a self-contained universe. Rather, it's only one small piece of a broader world where daily life has been violently disrupted. And again, Cherchoglian has labeled each of these scenes Armenian tragedy, and the description seems quite fitting. The second photograph confronts the viewer with a pile of reinforced concrete, rubble, and destroyed furniture, nearly identical to that in the first photograph, save the absence of the steel frame building. So it's clear that this is unfortunately another building that has been destroyed. And this image of a heap of debris is one of the recurring visual themes for Cherchoglian throughout the entire album. It is the subject of six other photographs. So that is, yeah, that is 8 out of 18 are dedicated to visual documentation of essentially just heaps of rubble. And this repetition to me is quite significant. It's been argued by photographic historians that serial photography, such as this, taking the same or a similar subject and taking repeated photos of it or similar things to it, serial photography is uniquely suited to the task of capturing traumatically inflected images and may hint at one of the photographer's purposes in the creation of the album. Literary critic Kathy Carruth argues that traumatic experiences are defined by their inherent incomprehensibility, as they do not immediately register their full impact with those who experience them. She is of the opinion that traumatic experiences cannot be understood fully in the moment and only gain their meaning through future instances in which the experience is reprocessed. And now, photographic historian Ulrich Baer has expanded on this argument to assert that photography of traumatic events allows the photographer to capture a moment that may be incomprehensible in order to provide a physical means of revisiting it in order to process the content later. In this sense, Bayer considers photography of trauma as a physical means by which to engage in the belated processing and reprocessing of traumatic events that Carruth terms repetitive seeing. Now, Bayer, in his analysis, is expressly referring to medical photographs by Charcot in 19th century France, which he used to document the fleeting behavioral symptoms of mental illness that he may not have understood, but needed a way to visually preserve so that he could analyze them for symptomological purposes. But we might similarly propose that Chertoglyan's fascination with piles of rubble on the streets of Gyumri in the days after the Spitak earthquake was a similar means by which he might hope to capture the city in its temporarily destroyed form for the purpose of future processing. This, for him, could have been a means of coming to terms with the destructive power of the earthquake long after its visible consequences or its architectural consequences had been removed from the landscape. However, when we also consider what those piles of rubble once were, we potentially add another layer of meaning to this project. Now, the image of a destroyed building, oops, there we are. The image of a destroyed building, particularly a destroyed residential building, as the majority of Chertoglyan's images um, are far from being terminal signs. Rather, they by and large suggest the previous existence of a building that was once whole, inhabited, and vibrant. And this photograph, the 18th in the album, communicates this message most vividly, in my view. Um, it's a cross section, but were this your average architectural cross-sectional drawing, it would not be of as much note. This is unfortunately the cross section of a lived-in residential building, a view that is only made possible because the building has collapsed. And we can see traces of wallpaper, of stenciled plaster here, of partitions, and this little lonely pendant light clinging to what remains of these apartments. They're small hints of the personalities and predilections of those who lived here prior to this building being rendered uninhabitable. And it's in my view, it is a rather fitting tribute to the lost, and such was Chertoglyan's admitted purpose in creating this album. He concluded this opus with a colophon inscription that read, I dedicate this album with all my heart to the holy memory of the victims of the December 7th, 1988 earthquake, as thousands of innocent lives were lost under the rubble. And in this explicit dedication of the work to the memory of lives lost on that day, Chertoglyan directs the attention of the viewer beyond the mere fact of architectural ruination and towards the human implications of that destruction, lest they be forgotten or subsumed by aestheticization of decay. For, in the words of memory historian Michael S. Roth, it is one thing to aestheticize the gradual decay of monumental buildings, but it is entirely another to aestheticize the effects of disaster. Chertoglyan's words and the contents of his images make the message quite clear that these buildings were once homes, now they are not, and may more than likely serve as burial sites for individuals who were lost when they collapsed. And in that violent change of state from place of life to place of death, there is a tragedy that must be remembered. Now, documenting tragic absence through documentation of spaces that are no longer inhabited is a rather poignant means of memorializing the deceased. And in this similar vein, I would like to highlight photographer Hrayir Sarkisyan's Last Scene series from 2018 to 2021, which documents the absence of victims of political violence with photographs of the locations where they were last seen before their disappearance, each embossed at the bottom, as you can see here, with their names and the date of disappearance. And in his project statement, Sarkisyan writes that there's a fine line between presence and absence in these locations, embodying the notion that these events are memorized in the physicality of the space. In other words, he says, the site stands in for the absence of the missing. And now, although Chertoglyan's subject is not political violence, his work does concern human victimization and memorialization of lives lost where the individual may not necessarily be representable anymore. So his subject becomes the last places where many of these victims were known to be alive, places where the events that led to their deaths occurred, using the site as a placeholder, pointing us to remember the person who is now lost. The destroyed building was both the cause of the loss of life and the final resting place of those whose lives it claimed, and as such becomes an incredibly complex visual metaphor. And I will also add that Sarkisyan and Chertoglyan's work also share a sense of eeriness in that they depict spaces of everyday comfort, such as this bed here, spaces in which people should have been able to be most at ease, that unfortunately became sites of violence and can no longer be understood in the same manner as before. Here we are. Now, Chertoglyan's 11th and 12th photographs present yet another possible reading of some of this content and what actually he means when he says that each of these images is an image of Armenian tragedy. The 11th and 12th images are outliers in the grand scheme of the album, as they are the only photographs with pre-Soviet non-residential architecture as their subject. This photograph here showing the remains of St. All Savior's Church on the city's central square. Although, interestingly, in contrast to the press photo that we saw earlier, the focus of this image is not on the bulk of the church that remains, but on the empty space that has been left by the part that has collapsed. This is as if to say, yes, some of the church has survived, but even more was lost. And we see this scaffolding in place in attempt to prevent the rest of the church collapsing. And then we have this 12th photograph, which shows more of the church ruins, namely this fluted stone-faced rubble masonry with the remnants of an engaged column here and the points of the former church cupola on the side here. Um, in front of these surviving apartment buildings. And when viewed in this manner, seeing the rubble of the church that has been destroyed, but the apartments that have been saved, and captioning it Armenian tragedy, I almost get the sense that it seems to be implied that the tragedy here is the loss of Armenian heritage in the form of the church, while these homes have survived. But at the same time, there is also a bit of joy in the fact that these homes have survived, since that means that their residents were likely able to survive. So it's quite a complex layering of what is tragedy, where is gratitude in this, where are these small moments where things contradict, things overlap, when you come back to it, how you interpret it differently. That is what I am getting at as the express purpose of this album. I don't. Uh, I don't hold the opinion that there is one correct way to view it, one intended way of processing the images that are preserved here, because I think the messiness is the point. The open-endedness is the point, allowing either the photographer himself to take the image, preserve the image, come back and see something differently. All of it he's labeling tragedy, but what exactly is the tragedy here? The opinion may be different at different times with different viewers at different stages of life. Um, a final a final layer to all of this that I have yet to fully explore is that embodied in this photograph, which shows a building that has not been destroyed, but is in fact under construction, still labeled Armenian tragedy. And there in this photo, there seems to be a layer of claiming that the infrastructure itself is a tragedy, as its catastrophic failure led to the destruction and the loss of life that has been documented in these previous photographs. So, as this is still a work in progress, admittedly, and my conclusions are slightly less than concrete. But again, I will reiterate that one thing that I've appreciated in this process of analyzing this album is that each time I return to it, I feel as though I am in a way, somewhat recreating this process that the album's creator may have been trying to get at in creating it. I, the first time I looked, I didn't necessarily know what I was seeing. I had a lot of questions like why take pictures of these same things over and over and over again? And then each time subsequently looking at it and thinking, okay, this might be the tragic part, or that might be the tragic part, or this is a different way to read this sort of image. And in that way, I found that my own analysis may be mirroring the actual process of witnessing and grieving these images of the city of Gyumri after its destruction. So that is where I will conclude for today. And I greatly look forward to everyone's thoughts, feedback, questions, all of it. Thank you so much for listening.